more about CSS, but in the form of CSS frameworks. We'll start by talking about resetting our CSS to make things uniform across lots of different browsers. So let's go ahead and dive right in. And if anyone has any questions, we've got the Slido up. If you want me to address something that we talked about yesterday or the day before, feel free, or before that even, to ask any questions. So let's talk about CSS resets. When we were writing our HTML last week, even though we didn't have any CSS actually written yet, when we would open up our HTML in the browser, there was some design to it. It was there, the H1s had a larger size than the H2s, and the paragraph tags were a smaller size than that, etc. So the browsers have these styles built into them. And it doesn't look super polished, but there's still that visual hierarchy that's inherent in those browsers. And what's happening is those browsers have those built-in CSS that they apply to our plain HTML. This default styling, it's useful when we used to not have as much control over our CSS, but nowadays we have so much more that we can do with our styling, and what was in the browsers originally sometimes get in the way of what we want to do, and making our CSS, our designs, look universal or uniform across lots of different browsers. And so if you leave those default styles, your experience can look different between Chrome or Safari or Firefox, etc. So to get rid of those default styles, we'll do what's called a CSS reset. And a CSS reset is just CSS code that we put in front of our own CSS styles, and it basically removes all of those default browser styles. In a big company, you might have your own development team that produces their own reset, but the vast majority of developers use some open source or freely shared resets that are available online. And two of the most popular of those are Eric Meyer's CSS Reset, and then a reset code called Normalize. And we're going to look at both of those right now. Okay, first let's look at Eric Meyer's Reset. And I'm going to share this link with you so you can have it if you'd like it. Okay, that's available in Slack. So basically, just looking at this code, this should feel a little bit familiar to you. We have our code for making a comment. So this just tells us what this code is. And then you can see CSS declarations for virtually every tag that's available in HTML. We have our HTML body div, our H1s, our paragraph, block quote, some you've probably never heard of. And all of these then get these CSS declarations, which are margin 0, padding 0, border 0, font size 100%. That's bringing all of those font sizes to the same size, makes the font inherit as the default characteristic, and then vertical align baseline. There are a few other changes for HTML5 specific browser concerns, and that is detailed there, making those display block declarations for those, and then a few other tags along the way. So with this just very short snippet of code, we have a reset, and I'll demonstrate what that looks like in just a second. But let's look at Normalize now. Normalize is a bit longer, and whereas the Eric Meyer's version of Reset 0, starting blank slate, this this version of a reset, which is called normalize, this version called normalize is trying to make things universal across browsers, but not necessarily eliminate all the existing styling. And I'll show you more of that later. But it's basically taking, and each of these codes, each of these tags has its own reset rather than giving everything a dump of 0. It's just taking those specific elements and attributes that they want to normalize that just are different between browsers. So someone's gone through a lot of work to find out what are those differences between the browsers. They've put this code up here for people to use. So you can see, as you read through body, main, H1, it's actually giving a font size that's using M's relative to its parent container. Horizontal rules, a few other tags, the A tag, the abbreviation tag, bold and strong tags, etc. So let me share this link with you as well so you can have access to this. As well. And let's look at what that looks like in Reset with CodePen. And let me show you a link with this as well so you can see. If you want to follow along. But basically, we just have some straight HTML. We've got our H1, we've got a nav area, and then we have an H2 with a section and paragraph tags and H2s along the way. So a pretty generic set of HTML. In CodePen, if you go to the settings area, you can access it in the top navigation or in this little tools area. You can actually do a reset using both Eric Meyer's reset and the normalized code and see what each of them looks like. Right now, there's no reset on them. I'm going to use Eric Meyer's, and we're going to save that. And as we do, I want you to pay attention as that closes, what happens to the code behind it. I may have left this sitting again too long. Nothing happened. Let's see. Okay, I am really haunted. Go back to neither, to reset, normalize. I'm gonna open this fresh again and see what's going on. I even tested everything out this morning, make sure everything was functioning properly. Okay, we're gonna dump this in here again. Okay. All right. Right now it's set to neither. I hit reset, save and close. This is what's supposed to happen. So you can see that when we hit reset, everything's gone. There's no visual hierarchy, no text hierarchy, nothing. It's just all the same serif font. It's all the same size. All the margins and borders are gone. So let's go back and see what it looks like with normalize. Save and close. We get some of that visual hierarchy back. We get to see that there are H1s have a larger text size, H2s have a smaller text size. It's gone from a serif font to a sans serif font. But there's a lot of this that's still there. And the idea behind normalize again is that we're just making the visuals similar across browsers rather than removing all the styling to start from scratch. So if you're working on a project where in your initial stages, you want to put on your HTML, you want it to maintain some of that visual hierarchy just in its default state, and then build from there. Then you can use normalize and know that across browsers, all of the changes you make should be universally applicable. If you want to just start from scratch, then reset is the way to go, and you can take all of that styling out there. What questions do you have about the reset process and how that works? So far, let's check the Slido. Nothing there. Okay, so I've shown you how we do a reset within CodePen using the settings. We are able to make it. Let's go ahead and put that back on there. But how do we do it in our own projects? Let's go back to our project that we were working on yesterday. I've got code in there that's working, at least it was this morning. I'm gonna go ahead and share what I'm working off of. And let's see. Here is the CSS. And here's the HTML. So we're all on the same page. You know how we add our own CSS styles to the project. When you're going to do a reset, you're basically, every time you have basically a set of CSS declarations that you want to keep fairly separate for future reference as you're making changes to your code, it's good to save independent CSS files because you can reference multiple CSS files in your process. So what we'll do is we'll create a new file in our folder and we'll call this reset.css. And we have a new CSS document within our folder that we have everything else in. And we will grab the files from one of those shared resources and reset. Grab Eric Meyer's reset first. So I select all that, hit copy, and now I will drop that in my reset.css folder. And paste that in. Hit save. File, we can see that it is going to the format that we expect with a comment and then all of those elements. We can see the CSS. It's a little bit more readable in our IDE. Now we can go back to our HTML page and I'm going to insert a new link into this. So typing link, hitting tab, that is a quick key for using this. So I just typed link, and it knows what a link is. I hit tab. It automatically fills in the rel attribute as a style sheet because that's the most common use of the link attribute. And then it leaves the href empty, and I can just put in reset.css. And now this file will reference that new document in there. So let's look at what happens to our dashboard when we apply reset to it, even after we've got our own styling in there. Probably the biggest differences you may have noticed are that our top level navigation items all have defaulted to a serif typeface. And we've lost a lot of our padding and margins. So let's look at that again. I'm going to go ahead and comment out that style sheet using my quick key of command and slash. And then let's refresh this page again. Let's see, I better save that. And then refresh. We gain our spacing back. And our font is now again a sans serif. Now let's see what difference that it makes if we add another link that's actually to the normalized version. So we will create a new file again. We'll call this, actually, we're going to use that same file and we just replace this CSS. Because normally you would only want to have one or the other of these, and putting it in a reset.css file is pretty typical the way developers use their resets. So I'm going to copy and paste from normalized, because this is so long. I want to see the raw. Click that raw button. And then that will allow me to just do Command A to select all, Command C to copy, and V to paste, and hit save. And I don't need to change the reference. I'll just uncomment that. We reference that CSS again. Now let's see what normalize does to our design. There was only, I don't know if you're able to notice it, but there was only a very small shift in some of the spacing in this text, but all the fonts stayed the same relatively. So with reset, you're going to 0 and basically have to declare code for just about everything in CSS in order for it to look reasonable. But with normalize, you can have things that you don't have to declare and it'll still look relatively designed. And that provides some value in certain contexts. So what questions do you have about resetting CSS?
I'm not actually sure if I understood why we would do this.
Okay. So the biggest reason from my perspective that you do a CSS reset is it gives you control across all browsers in what people are seeing when you do the design. It was even more common earlier in the web development, and now it's not as much of a problem, but the browsers would display lots of different defaults. So the spacing, the default font size were all often varied between those browsers, and there's still some variance between them. So if you as a designer want to have full control of what your design looks like, then we would want the developers to do that reset so that they're not having to mess around with changing margins on just one browser versus on another in order to keep everything looking just right. And there are implications in terms of where things wrap, where things go below the fold, where things are on a visual hierarchy scale. For if we don't do a reset, then we often have those types of discrepancies. So different users get different experiences.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions about it? That was a great question. All right, I'm going to ask JP. Let's see, let me stop sharing for a second. JP, I just wanted to know what, in your view, is the difference between the two resets that I just described, if you were to put it into your own words?
The resets. I think you're talking about the resets between the CSS, right?
So we're talking about normalize and then Eric Meyer's reset. So those two different codes that I demonstrated, just trying to get a sense of whether people understand the difference between the two and how they're, how you might use one versus the other.
So the Eric Meyer's resets, I'm not too sure about that. But when it comes to actually just resetting like the CSS, I think the main point of resetting it is if you already have existing CSS codes, I believe.
Okay. Usually you do a reset before you actually write your own CSS, so that as you're writing, as you're designing and testing the CSS that you're writing, that it is representing what would be universally seen across both browsers.
Right.
Great. Kelsey, what would you say is the difference between reset and normalize, if you were to put it in your own words?
I don't think I'm ready to, I don't think I can articulate it at this point. Sorry.
Okay. Is there anyone who feels like they sense or know the difference between the two?
I mean, the normalized one will keep a little bit of the text hierarchy, like the sizes for H1, H2, while the other one completely erase everything, and you'll have everything in the same font as what I saw.
Okay. Yeah, that is essentially the main difference between the two. That with reset, we have a complete wiping of the information. So let's just go back to that code pen again. And we have a CSS reset. And look at what happens. All of the styling is gone. Basically, it's a bring it to zero reset of all of that CSS. So as a designer, as a developer, you can then write all the CSS and know that your CSS is going to be exactly as you intended, and you'll see all the changes as they go. Whereas with let's look at normalize. And normalize is a reset that keeps some of that visual hierarchy, some of the sizing for H1s. So you can see with normalize, you have a baseline of CSS that exists. With reset, basically, all of the CSS is down to zero.
Why would you use reset then? Why do you want to put it back to zero?
Reset gives you an added measure of control of knowing that everything that you write in your CSS, any visual difference you see in your code or in the output of your code is going to be something that you created. When you use normalize, there are things that you might not have coded, and so you don't necessarily know why something is that size unless you go back and read that code. So it's kind of a nuance of difference, and oftentimes it's the preference of what a developer wants to start from. When I was doing my coding, I always did the Eric Myers reset and just set everything to zero, because I preferred to have that knowledge that everything that is created from a style standpoint will be something that I actually made, and I'll know where those pieces are and what changes I would be making. Does that make sense?
Sort of. I was just thinking, when you do a reset, well, why would you have pre-existing code? Is it from another developer, or if you're writing something from scratch, there should be like, I thought everything's starting from scratch.
No, that's a great question. So this goes back to some of what we talked about before in terms of like the default font size on a browser is 16 points, and that's built into the browser. So there are other styles that are built into the browser for each of the elements. So in Chrome, they've decided to make H1s a specific size and H2s a specific size and a specific font weight, so that when it pulls up HTML that's structured, that's semantically built, then because they know what the meaning is of those tags, then they automatically apply some styling to them. And that makes it easier for people who are just quickly trying to put together an HTML document, could just put it out there and it would render in a semantically meaningful way, because we have those tags that have been assigned code just by the browser, the people who created the browser in the first place. So you're starting from zero, in the sense that you're writing code from scratch, but the browser already has code in the terms of styling that's already existing in it.
I get it now. Thank you so much.
Okay. No problem. Any other questions? That was good. That was a great question. I'm glad you asked that.
So typically, would developers start with 0, which is what's the name of that one again?
That's the Reset by Eric Meyer.
Reset by Eric Meyer. Is that like more typical than just normalize?
To be honest, I don't know what current developers are using more frequently. I think that my preference is the CSS Reset, and rather than the normalized version. But I don't know which is more common.
Okay.
I've seen normalized used more, actually.
Have you?
Yes.
Okay. I do believe that may be something that is because I was coding as professional years ago. So Eric Meyer's was more prominent, and normalized has probably been emerging in these more recent years. So normalized certainly, as Christina said, it may be something that's used more now.
So when you're, say for example, if we were to start from scratch last week with the reset, would we still be having H1s, H2s, and then we would have to specify each one of those, the font sizes and all that?
Right. Yes. So that is what everything basically that will display on that screen would need to be declared as some size, some font, some weight. And in some regards, we're doing that anyway. But if your design didn't necessarily have H2s or H3s, H4s, that sort of thing, then if sometime somewhere down the line, if nobody had declared what those should be, then they would come up as basically a 12-point font, whatever it is that CSS or the Reset does. So yeah, that is probably why the value of normalize is that if you are not seeing some of those elements on your design, then at least that normalize has accounted for some of that and not removed all of the styling.
Okay. And would you specify these sizes of your H1s, H2s within the head, or is that still going to be in the body?
So you will link to your style sheet as normal in the head, and then in this area you would probably put at the beginning, if you're having a different font, for example, for the H tags, you might do something like H1, H2, H3, etc., and then declare that font family. You can give that a declaration. So somewhere at the beginning of your CSS file, you'll set those codes. And sometimes that's another thing that developers sometimes do in their resets, is they don't have to take this as the gospel. They can use this as the baseline, but then maybe they know that all of their bodies are going to have a specific margin. And so they can come in here and say, we want 2 pixels to be our base margin, or 8 pixels, whatever it is. And they could come and go to their H1 and use whatever reset, whether reset or normalize, and say, okay, H1s are all going to be a font family. So they could insert that here in this reset one. And then this becomes the baseline that everything else is built on. And as in all development, there's more than one way to accomplish the task that you have at hand, and each developer might do it slightly differently. But this would be a good place to declare some of those base level attributes for each of the tags in that reset.css file. But it could come just at the head of your, if you just use the plain reset that you copy and paste from somebody else, and you just to the top of your main CSS file. Did that answer the question you were asking? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking. Okay, so let's talk about frameworks a little bit. With CSS resets, we're standing on the shoulders of these giants, these early pioneers in CSS and web development. We're using their code that they've produced. And within that developer community, we have this idea of sharing code that and their work that's called open source. And you may have heard that term before. But basically, developers make their source code open and available to any other developer who wants to use it and improve their development. And in some fields that may seem counterintuitive and not a viable model for building out a web business. But so many companies and developers rely on these open source contributions from their peers that they want to make that open source code better and offer fixes and feature improvements to that code. And so we have an open source community that's just a huge benefit to web development and development in general. Excuse me. And if you find that you're liking working with HTML and CSS and code, it pays to be involved with coding in that developer community of open source communities. One of those open source communities that is really popular in web development are CSS frameworks. And a CSS framework is basically a set of pre-styled elements and components that you can drop directly into your code, and they just work. And they're incredibly powerful tools for rapidly prototyping and developing user interfaces. And these CSS frameworks come in two flavors. One is open source, like I've been talking about, and then the other form of CSS framework is called internal. They're developed by internal teams or a single developer for their own use. And those internal frameworks tend to be tightly coupled with the design system, so that the designers and the developers are working with the same components within that design system, within that organization. So a CSS framework is something that's available for you just basically copy and paste a bunch of CSS code, or you link to a new CSS document that has all of this code, and then they've got the well-documented components with the associated classes or IDs for each of those elements. And then you can just start putting those into your HTML, and it automatically is styled and they're useful. So we will show you how that works. But let's just take a 3-minute break really quick, grab a drink, whatever you need, and we'll come back and do that again. Okay, we're back. So I guess I gave you just a basic overview of what a CSS framework is. Now we're going to actually look at one and see how it works a little bit. So I just shared a link in the Slack channel to getsbootstrap.com. Bootstrap is one of the most popular CSS frameworks, open source CSS frameworks that's available. So when you come to Bootstrap, you can see a little bit about it, how to grab it. The documentation gives us an idea of what is available to us in this CSS framework. So we can see that there is a CSS link that we could use to paste into our site, just like a lot of others. I'm going to copy that because I'm going to need it in just a minute. There's also JavaScript that's associated with some of the components. And so you would link to those scripts and be able to reference those in order to use it in your HTML as well. But we won't dive into that today so much. It's very simple to use a CSS framework in the sense that they provide a lot of documentation for how you implement each of the pieces, and they provide examples, things like that. So there are layouts, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the layout, but it provides an even easier way to lay out your page than using Flexbox. And maybe some of you are saying Flexbox wasn't easy at all, so how could that be? But this is a pretty straightforward way to use that, and Flexbox is a lot easier than using floats, in my opinion, which is what you would have to do otherwise. So they have a grid, and it's set up on a 12-column grid, basically. So the way Bootstrap works is you have a container that has, so let's look at that overview again. A container that can either be all the way full screen on your file, or it can provide some margins on either side. Once with containers, then you have rows, and those rows will allow you to just basically stack elements on each other. And within those rows, you have a column structure that's based on a 12-column grid. Bootstrap also has its own reset that's built into the framework, so you don't have to put in the Eric Myers reset or normalize, because it has its own, that then they've built this framework on top of that reset. So that exists as it's called the reboot. And then you're able to set up your font families, and heading styles are established. And you can definitely override them with your own styles. But all of this is documented and put into the framework so that you'll be able to have access to it. And then there are components. I'll just look at these a little bit. There are alerts and badges and buttons, and all of this is provided with just a matter of copying and pasting a little bit of HTML and CSS, and you suddenly have an established design that you can base your design on. So let's look at a few of these things in CodePen just so we get a sense. With CSS, again, here we've gone back to the settings in CodePen. I'm going to remove that reset that I had in there, so it goes back to being neither. And here you can reference external style sheets or JavaScript. So I copied that link from Bootstrap, Oops. Okay, so that Bootstrap CSS file works just like our own that we linked within our own file. I just post it here, paste it here, and I save it, and then I have access to Bootstrap now. So if I go back to Bootstrap, let's pull this up to the side a little bit, and I want to use a button, then I can grab and copy and paste this button tag and paste it into my HTML, and it automatically appears, it's styled, it's ready to go, and I can interact with it. And we can do that with another button up here, a success button. Copy that. Paste in that, and I have another button. So you can begin to see the appeal of using a framework like this. All I had to do is paste the link to that CSS style sheet, and I suddenly have access to all of these components, and I can use them for whatever I need to use in my device or in my design. So some of these interactions where you see, like in this carousel where things are animating through, that would requiring pulling in some JavaScript as well. But those JavaScript things are just as easy to copy and paste as the style sheet, so that you have access to those. So all these are available to us. Let's put in an alert and see what that looks like. Put one here. Paste that in there, and it's there. I can make adjustments just because you can see here in this code. Hope you can read that a little bit. But basically, all of these elements are just divs or buttons or some HTML element that then have a class assigned them to them, or multiple classes as well. So this is an alert, and it's an alert primary. And if I look here and I see there's alert secondary, there's alert success, alert danger. If I just were to change this to danger, then it changes the color of that alert, and we can see that it's just taken on the values of that new class as defined in the Bootstrap CSS. Okay, what questions do you have about a CSS framework or Bootstrap in particular?
So these are just like code components that are already there for you to copy and paste into your work.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's super helpful. Now, something that as you become familiar with it, you'd be able to be surfing the internet and see a site that was built on Bootstrap, because all the components look the same. And that happened for a while with a lot of people. Just the ease of use of Bootstrap is awesome, and so people can spin up a website fairly quickly and have all of this interactivity available to them. It starts to feel a little bit generic when you do that, but it's awesome for prototyping if you have that opportunity and you say, I have a concept for how someone might interact with a certain user flow or something like that. You say, I can quickly get this up in HTML and CSS on a web browser so that I could do some user testing with Bootstrap in half a day, something like that. And then you can do a usability study and watch somebody work through the flow, see where the errors are, and you go back to the drawing board and do your own designs that are more nuanced, more unique, bespoke, and have a better website. But this is, and it's certainly usable by anybody, even in production environments. But for user experience designer especially, this becomes a cool way to get prototyping quickly if you're so inclined. yeah, it's plug and play, copy and paste, and you're really up and running very quickly, because there's form components, there's buttons, there's alerts, there's basically anything that you need to do an interactive website is available in Bootstrap. And it's just been getting better over the years. There are other CSS frameworks, but this one is the most popular.
I just have a quick question. Why, like, I was under the impression if you want to get something out for user testing, then you just throw a prototype on Figma really quickly. So I don't understand why you need to code something to do user testing, where you could just have it on Figma and you don't even need to code anything.
That's really very true, that there are interactions that you can't mimic in InVision very well. And you can do them with a CSS framework like this. So if you have, for example, a drop-down menu within your site where there's an interaction, you could make some choices and they have to choose that choice. In InVision, you can do something similar, but it requires 6 screens for all of that. And
yeah,
to make all those screens, that can be cumbersome. But so there's different levels of fidelity at which you could do user testing. And this is just another option that gets you a little closer to reality fairly quickly without having to dive into the production level type coding or get to a really refined design before you can test out an idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
No
so
problem.
like forms as well, right? Because it's kind of
and forms
person to design.
Yeah, so this allows you to have form fields that you can do inputs, and they can actually enter the input, submit the button, and it can then take you to a new page and have in response to that. So yeah, you're getting into that more realism, which gives you higher quality feedback. And that's a decision you make as user experience designer. All along the way, do you say, do I bring in users now? If I have the budget for it, you should bring them on at all levels and just get some feedback and reaction to your designs. If you have only one chance to do a usability study and that's all you have a budget for, and you have to decide, do I do it at InVision or do I do it at CodePen, or in Bootstrap, then which will take me the least amount of time to get the best kind of information, and you make that decision. And the more interactivity you have in your proposed solution, the more you might want to go to a prototype at this level versus InVision. But both are viable options, for sure. Do you have any other questions right now that I could answer? Okay, so let's talk about the grid system. And we are going to just use this. Oops. And we've got our CSS. We've got Bootstrap in here. So with the way Bootstrap works, as I mentioned before, you start with a container. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a div and its class. And this would be a good time, fingers on keyboards, to practice doing this. So we have a div with a class of container. And within the container, let's go back to Bootstrap for a minute. We have container, which is a container that has margins on either side of it, so it's not filling the full viewport. And then we have container fluid, which is filling the full viewport. So let's look at what those differences are. I'm going to just add some text here. Hello world. And we're going to add a little bit of our own CSS so that we can see the background of this. So I'm going to say class container and give it a background color. And just make the text color white. So we have this paragraph within a container, and you can see the container has margins on either side. And as I shrink or grow a container with above basically, above basically the mobile size, then there will always be a margin around it. If I make this container fluid, so -fluid, did I type that right? Should be container fluid. Oh yeah, I need to change this class too so we can see the background. Fluid. Then at any size, this container fills that viewport. So this can be useful to know, am I going to be having some background color that needs to fill my whole screen, or can I create just a very small container so that it doesn't end up taking up all that room, and that becomes part of your design decision. But those are the tools that you can use to see that. So we'll make this container, and then we will start putting in elements. As I mentioned before, we're dealing with rows and a 12-column grid. So the next element that goes in here would be a row. Class equals row. So the default behavior for those divs in HTML is going to be putting them, stacking on each other. We already have that container. So oops, I'll add a class here equals row. And now we have the default behavior of Bootstrap, which is to have no padding inside of these row containers, and they're just for creating a space on the page to use putting in other elements. So we start with rows, and then we move to to columns, and we have 12 columns to work with, and you can basically create any combination of one column up to 12 columns and adding all those together to equal 12 columns. So let's do an example div here. Okay. And we're going to copy this. Actually, by make this class equals call one. And we are going to copy. Actually, I want to, yeah, we'll do that. Copy this a few times. And we will do call 2, call 3, call 4, and then call 2. And to help us visualize this a little bit better, I'm going to do class column 1 call 2 call 3 call 4, and I think that's all I have. I'm going to give them a border. So that gives us a sense of what each of these columns is. Basically, we've divided up this column into, or this row into 12 column spaces. This first one is 1 column, so it's column 1. The second one is 2 columns wide, so it's a little wider, and that's what this call 2 means. This one is 3 columns. The next one is 4 columns, and then the last one is again 2 columns. So just to avoid confusing you, since I have these all in the same order, I'm going to move this one down. And oops, copy. Close that div. Okay. So we can see I just shifted those columns around, and now I have one that's 4 columns here, one that's 2 columns, one that's 3 columns, another one that's 2 columns, and one that's 1 column. What questions do you have about this grid and layout so far? This slide of questions there. You can see that this is also responsive. So it's the 12 column grid is not a set width for each column. It's flexible according to the size of the screen. So it's very great for responsive design. I can answer any questions right now. Go back to normal size here. The responsiveness of Bootstrap is also very handy because you can make declarations of column sizes based on viewport size. So let's look at what we mean there. So you can see in this example here that they have, let's see if we can bump that up a little bit. In this example, they have column SM. So what they've done in Bootstrap is to add small, medium, large, and extra large as class declarations that helps you then plan for designing for responsive designs. So you can start from a baseline of what you want mobile to look like, and that begins the what we've done here would be considered that column for the default. And then if you want to say it needs to change for viewport sizes larger than, in this example, if we wanted to do medium, larger than 768, then we could use the call dash medium or MD in order to declare that. So what does that look like? So let's say I want this to be a single column off for now. Excuse me. Add a div here. Add 12. It's not reloading. Oh, I forgot the period there. Okay. So now we have a border. Actually, this is let me do 2 columns here of each. Oops. We'll do the same thing here. So what I'm doing is I'm creating 2 column layout. And if I wanted to change this at a larger fonts or at a larger screen size to change the width of one of those columns, then I can change this to call medium 3, and this one will be call 9. So we can see that change where I'm at a larger screen size, larger than 768. And I'm going to add this one more declaration here, call medium 3 and call medium 9. So you can see those borders again. As I shrink down my viewport size, once it got below 768, the column size switched. So we now have even columns of 6 and 6 each. So basically what we're saying is that whenever the viewport is larger than 768, then the class dot MD will take precedent. And if it's larger than that, then just the straight column, or smaller than that, then just this column declaration takes precedent. And you have 5 different breakpoints basically that you can use this functionality within Bootstrap to be able to add or change columns based on that layout. So what we're going to do is give you a chance to work on this in a couple of breakout groups. We'll just be working on this and trying. We'll try to use these declarations with Bootstrap to find my window now. Here we go. To recreate this design here. So we have 2 different designs, one where the columns are even and one where the columns are different. The idea is we're going to go in to using Bootstrap to try to recreate those designs that change based on how big the browser size is. Okay, so let me share this code pen with you. I'm going to set up a couple of breakout groups, just so if you have questions as you're going along, to sort of work with each other, try to distribute these. Okay, just a couple of breakout groups. I'm going to open those up, and I just want you to start following the directions in that challenge and see what you can do. And I'll set the timer for about 10 minutes, and you can let me know if you get done quicker than that. Everyone else should be joining us in just a second. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So I thought I would go through and show you how I approach this problem and this challenge, and then see if you have any additional questions after I do that. But the first thing we have to start out with is to have our Bootstrap put in. So just as a reminder, you add your Bootstrap by coming to the settings, either clicking here, or you can click up here to the settings and you paste it into here.
We don't see the screen.
Oh,
You're not
sorry.
sharing
Thank
your
you for the
screen.
reminder. Okay, going back again, you can either click in this icon there or in the settings menu in the top, and you just paste in that code from Bootstrap, and it's just the Bootstrap link itself and not a lot of the other material that's on Bootstrap when you go to grab the code. Actually, simply you add it to your own file, but the only thing that you need for our purposes in CodePen is to just grab that href attribute. So copy that, paste it in here, and then we have access to all of Bootstrap in our CodePen. Then we would add HTML, and we start with a div container for the Bootstrap. So class equals container. Close the div. And then it's going to have 2 rows. So I'm going to create 2 divs that are row class. And I'm just going to copy and paste that because they're. So we have class container and 2 rows. Now we get to our columns. So div class equals, and I'm just going to make it like that. And we have basically what amounts to, when we look at these designs, 2 columns, or 2 columns in each of those rows. Same thing here. So it'll be 2 divs that I'm creating for each one of those. Okay, and I'm going to copy and paste that into the second row. So we have what will be our columns. Now, with our classes, we can start getting the colors in there so that we know what it is that we're going to be dealing with. And in our example, we have red, blue, then green, then yellow. So I'm going to go ahead and say red, red, green, and yellow. And because each of these needs content, I'm going to go ahead and put in, let's do an H1. Going to be, I think, red with the next, or 1, the number 1 exclamation point. Two. 3. And 4. Now, to make this responsive, I'm thinking mobile first. And because my instructions are that the first mockup should be for screens that are less than 768. So I'm thinking of that as my mobile version. And then the other screen, this one would be screens that are larger than that. So when I go back to Bootstrap and look at their, let's see, their documentation, I'll make this wide because I went under layout. I think it's under the grid, sorry, under the grid. And we can see that this medium declaration would be above 768, and the regular column would be anything less than 576, and that would become the default for the small as well. So nothing would change for the small unless we had a declaration of column small. So I'll start by saying, because I have a 12 column grid, and in my design, this looks to be even, so I would assume 6 columns, and this one six columns, column widths in that. So I'm going to go ahead and say class red will be col 6, and class blue will be col 6. And the same for green and yellow, col 6. So I'm telling the computer that I have 2 rows and there are 2 columns in each row, and each of those columns is going to be the width of 6 columns. So now that design is staying true for all viewport sizes, and it's essentially that design. Excuse me. Now I want to make these changes. When I look at this layout, it looks like this is probably 2 columns, and then I do some math and see, does that sound right? Is that 2 columns, 2 columns? No, that feels like that might be a little bit small.
That's
So
3 for that
so-
one.
That those
so
small ones look like 3.
So this one looks like it's probably 3 then, you're right. And the rest would be 9, because 9 plus 3 is 12. So I can do, for this one, the first one is going to be col, and because I want this to be everything above 768, I'm using the column medium declaration, column hyphen MD. And let's see, come back to here, and it's going to be 3 for the first one, and column medium 9 for the second one. So I'm beginning to see that. So it's basically the reverse for the other one. So col medium 9 and col medium 3. So then a larger than 768, I've got this design that spreads out that way. And as I shrink my screen size at 768, it switches to the 2 even column format. So without even having to touch my CSS at all, just using the classes that already exist in Bootstrap, I'm able to do this fairly, otherwise would be fairly complex type of layout that's responsive to different screen sizes just by applying those classes to each one of these elements. Okay, what questions can I answer? Is there anything that I can help explain a little bit further in this?
Can you screenshot this and post it on Slack, please? Because that will be helpful to go back to it and trace the steps back.
Sure. Do you want just this right here?
Yeah,
What you're seeing? Oops.
Yeah. If you don't mind, thank you.
No problem. I'm happy to.
My column 4 is misbehaving.
Okay, let's see if we can.
And mine is not responsive. It's not going into the equal columns when I put it smaller.
Okay, let me stop sharing. And Serena, was that you that first asked? Okay, if you want to share what you've got, let's see if we can troubleshoot.
So column 4 is not in line with these guys. But it is responding to collapsing into equal parts. However, it's just...
Okay, it looks like you might have an extra div within that row. And so I wonder if that's being interpreted weirdly. Div class or div.
You have 3 divs at the bottom. I think you only need 2.
You also have MED in your class name instead of just MD for the last 3 columns. So in the first one that it's okay, but the next one it says MED instead of MD, and then the same with the bottom too. And there we go.
There we go.
Exactly.
Always great. Thank you.
Awesome. Solved it easily. Great. And then who else? Someone else had a.
It was me.
Okay.
Let me try the camera. So it's not responsive. She is doing that. And this is what I have. 2 divs same row, 2 divs in each row, and then 1 div that's the container.
The yellow, or they should all be column 6, right?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
And nope.
No?
Oh wait. Yeah. Right here. Cool.
Man, it's typos. It's always typos.
Yeah. That's the bane of developers' existence.
Oh
Where
my
was I? Like one little character somewhere messed everything up. Okay. What other questions can I help answer? Are there additional ones? Okay, what let's do is let's take another let's do a 5-minute break. Actually, let's just make it 3 minutes, and then we will talk a little bit more about using this, and then we'll talk about the assignment for today. So let's take a quick break, grab a drink, and then we'll be back. Okay. Okay, let's think hypothetically about our design for our employee dashboard. We think of this in terms of how we might handle this in Bootstrap. We know what we went through over the last couple of days to try to get it responsive like this. So how would you do that with Bootstrap, and does that happen easily? So we're going to create just the basic layout, and thinking in terms of what that design is, we think we've got one row here that has two columns. Then we have another row here with 4 columns. So each of those columns would be essentially a 3-column as part of the grid. So 3 column, 3 column, 3 column, 3 column makes a total of 12 columns. And then there's another row with a single column, it would be 12 column wide. So I come to my pen and I've got 1 row, 2 rows already. So I'll add a div class equals row div. This would be the nav. So P, we'll call this nav. Then we have the next row, which would have 4 columns in it. So right now we have just 2. So I'm going to copy and paste this again. And because I've got my numbers mixed up here, we'll come back to that and fix those. But then we have another row, same deal. Right now there's 2 columns. Make that 4 columns. And then we have 1 more div class equals row p footer, and close the div. So our layout is messed up because we've got the columns named wrong. So if I am thinking about the way we want our design to look, when it is in its smallest form, and it will be a single column. So basically a 12-column width when we're thinking Bootstrap. So for the column, let's see. So by making each of those 12, when I get down to the smallest size, it is putting it as a single row. And when I get to column, I go back here, column small, and the medium would be tablet. So I might say at column medium, I want each of those to be actually so we have 2 cards on at each point. So I'm going to go ahead and say 6, 6, 6, 6. And then I want, when it gets larger, to actually for there to be 4 cards. So I'm going to go at above 992, just for the sake of argument. It's going to be call large, and that will be 3 columns each. See, I want to actually copy and replace this because I don't want to have to write that again in that second section. Down to this row, replace that with what I had. And now from a layout perspective, we have at the largest size, there would be 4 cards. You get smaller, there'd be 2 cards. And then when you get to the smallest point, then that's down to a single row. Obviously, there's need for making design changes for making each of these columns styled right. But you can see how quickly the layout goes. In just about 5 minutes or so, we moved from no layout to a responsive design that could accommodate those cards that we created. And if we just add the individual card styling to this style or to this Bootstrap layout, we very quickly get to layout in putting a prototype together or even a website. What questions emerge from watching me do that? Anything? So today we went over resets for CSS that give us a chance to start from a clean slate with our CSS. I introduced both normalize and the reset that was created by Eric Meyer. Then we talked a little bit about frameworks in general and about open source, how some frameworks are put together by open source communities and those are available for anybody to use. You always want to check for what that license is in the open source. So for example, when we look at this reset, Eric has given this, he says, if you want to use my reset styles, feel free. It's all explicitly in the public domain. I have to formally say that or else people ask me about licensing. So it's all available and he just has this license in there to declare it. And it's always good when you're borrowing from other people's sites that when it's in the open domain, you include the license that they have there just so others coming back to it would know where to find it and that it's used with permission, that sort of thing. So we talked about reset, we talked about frameworks, we talked about open source, introduced Bootstrap as a way to utilize open source content to help speed up your development processes, give these frameworks and use them. We just touched on it today. We'll go more into frameworks a little bit tomorrow, but that's what we've got for today. And does anybody have any last questions about that? Okay, for today's assignment, there is a couple of code pens that you can go to and follow the directions inside of them. Again, as usual, there's explicit instructions, change elements and things like that in there. And then there's another code pen for practicing grid. So first one is review, and then there's some practice. And then we have stretch goals, review the work that you did yesterday, recreating the mobile and desktop mockups, and fork that existing work into a new code pen, and then use Bootstrap to do the interfaces layout rather than the way that you did the layout before, and make sure that it's responsive. So I understand that we've been able to get through some of these assignments very quickly in the last couple of days, and that's awesome. Glad to hear it. So taking the time to practice, looking for a UI, if you've gone beyond these stretch goals and you still have time, make use of it and develop, try to recreate some website or some design that you see on Dribble or something using these tips and tools that we've taught over the last few days to see how everything works. If something is unique, how do they handle it, and how can you handle it? So definitely go forward if you're getting through things very quickly, and just the more you type, the more you get comfortable with this code by actually doing it, the better off you'll be in the long run. And with that, sharing that in the usual fashion for the assignment. And that is it for me today. There's no more questions in the Slido. I will stay on till the top of the hour, but you are all excused, free to go, and I'll stay on as long as there might be someone who may have questions. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Looks like everybody. Any concerns or comments on your end?
No, I don't have any right now. Yeah,
All
thanks for asking.
Yeah, no problem. Have a great day. Oh, is that?
Yeah, I just remembered. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I can't remember. Is the code we did during class, is that the same as the exercise, or is it different?
As you mean as the assignment?
Yeah, because I think some people might want to use the code we did today in lecture as a reference for the assignment.
Oh, okay.
Would you mind posting it in the channel?
Yeah, I will do that.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool, you bet. Have a great afternoon.
All right, thanks, Christian. You too.
See ya.
Bye.